My name is Maya Delgado. I am 32 years old, a woman who keeps receipts in color-coded envelopes and a spare pen in every coat pocket because order is how I calm a wild day. And I live in Denver, Colorado, in a two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a brick building that holds heat in winter like a good secret. And I am married to a man named Chris, who is 34 and charming in the way that makes waiters remember his order, and landlords forgive him one late fee. And I work as an assistant manager at a credit union where I spend my days explaining to people that money is just a set of decisions wearing numbers. And I like my job because I like the truth of a ledger and the way a balance tells you who you are without adjectives. And I keep a small savings account separate from our joint account. Not hidden, just mine. A habit I learned from my mother, who taught home health aides for 25 years and said a woman should have money with her own name on it for emergencies and dreams. And my dream lately had been a 10-day trip to Oaxaca to take a cooking class with my aunt and eat mole I did not have to make. So for 18 months, I set up an automatic transfer on the first of every month, and when tips from my side catering gigs came in, I skimmed the top like cream and moved it into that account too. And I watched it grow with the steady pleasure of a garden where you can count the tomatoes. And then one Tuesday in September at 6:41 a.m., I logged into the account while I stirred coffee because that is my morning ritual. Check the numbers, check the weather, check my shoulders to remind them to go down. And the number on the screen looked like a body after a haircut. $2,000 light. And for a full 4 seconds, I thought I had typed the wrong password into the right life. And then I clicked the transaction history and saw a Zelle transfer the night before, at 11:58 p.m. to a contact named C's Travel. Not mine, not a vendor I knew, and I closed my eyes because closed eyes sometimes bring back the room you had before you opened them. And when I opened them again, the number did not change, and I checked the memo line. It said, "Return soon." And I stood very still in my kitchen, with the spoon still in the coffee, and the coffee still swirling, and I let the swirl in my chest finish its circle, and I asked out loud, "Who?" Because sometimes the question in the air shakes the name off the branch. And I walked to the bedroom and looked at my husband, his arm flung over his face, and I said, "Chris," and he groaned and said, "5 more minutes." And I said, "Did you send $2,000 from my savings last night?" And he sat up like a man who has remembered a stove left on, and he said, "I borrowed it. I was going to tell you." And I said, "You borrowed it from my account that has my name on it, and a separate login that you know only because I told you in case I got hit by a bus." And he ran his hand through his hair the way people do in movies when they need to look like they are thinking. And he said, "It's for a trip." And I said, "For a trip to where and with who? And why is my money the suitcase?" And he said, "It's a work thing. A quick flight to Vegas for 3 nights. Networking." And I laughed the kind of laugh that sounds like a cough because my husband is a line cook at a brewery that does not network anywhere except at the food truck window. And he said, "My friend Carlos is opening a pop-up there. Investors will be around. I have to show up or I'm stuck on the grill forever." And I said, "You have to show up on a ticket paid for with my Oaxaca fund." And he said, "I'll pay it back." And I said, "When?" And he said, "When I get a raise." And I said, "So after your trip paid for by my raise." And he said, "Don't make this a thing." And I said, "It is already a thing. The number is smaller and the story is bigger." And he stood up and said, "Maya, please, I needed to do something for my career. You know how tired I am. You know how much I want more." And he has a soft spot in me because I do know how tired he is. And I do know the hot metal feel of a kitchen and the ache of a man who thinks the elevator skipped his floor. But I also know theft with a pet name is still theft. And I said, "You cannot borrow without permission. That is taking." And he said, "We're married. "What's mine is yours." And I said, "Not when what's yours is missing and what's mine is moving." And he made a sound like a man dropping a tool and said, "Fine, I'll cancel." And he reached for his phone and then said, "I can't cancel. It's non-refundable." And I said, "Of course it is." And I felt the morning like a road I had walked before, small lies paving over big holes. And I took a breath and said, "We will talk tonight." And I went to work and spent my day opening accounts for people who could show me every deposit for the last year and a half. And between signatures, I typed C's travel into my mind and let the letter C stretch to fill the room. And at lunch, I went outside and called my aunt and told her what happened. And she said in Spanish that love is not a certificate of deposit. You do not draw on it without making a deposit first. And I told her I would still come to Oaxaca even if I had to do 2 more catering gigs a month. And she said, "Or he could give it back." And I said, "Or he could give it back." And I returned to my desk and reset a password and scheduled an alert on my savings for any move over $50. Because if you cannot trust a person, you trust the text that arrives when they try. And at 5, I went home to a conclusion I could smell in the hallway: cologne on a suit that does not fit right. He was dressed. He had a backpack open with 2 shirts and a pair of shoes thrown in like the idea of leaving did not make neat piles. And he was on the phone saying, "Yeah, man, 9 o'clock. I'll crash on your floor if the hotel fills up." And I stood in the doorway and he ended the call and looked at me like a man who wants a shrug to fix a wall. And he said, "I'll bring a bottle back." And I said, "Bring the money back." And he said, "I will." And he kissed my cheek and said, "Love you." And he left. And the door closed, and the room became the shape of a woman who just learned what she already knew. Act 1 has a way of running into Act 2 like a hallway that forgot the door. The problem got bigger when the text that followed his boarding pass was not a picture of a gate, but a picture of a pool. And not a pool in Vegas. A pool in Cancun. And I stared at the blue like the kind of blue that is expensive and smug. And the caption said, "Finally treating myself." And I sat down on our gray couch and felt the gray in a new way. I scrolled his social for 10 seconds and saw 2 more posts: a shot of a beach, a shot of a dinner plate with shrimp, and then I scrolled the comments to see who the audience was. And there she was, a name I had seen on his phone once and asked about. Sienna, with a heart and a flame. And he had responded with a wink. And my hands did not shake because my body had decided to conserve battery. And I opened my blue envelope file and took out my savings plan for Oaxaca and ran my finger down the line of deposits like a prayer. And I stood up and made a list because a list is how you keep rage from doing your thinking. And the list said, 1, freeze the Zelle on my account to contacts not on my approved list. 2, transfer the remaining savings to my credit union share that requires 2 signatures for withdrawal. 3, move rent money to a brand new checking and leave the joint account with bill pay only. 4, call the travel company tomorrow and ask what the return looks like if a traveler cannot go back the way he came. 5, breathe. 6, eat something. And I did the first 3 in 20 minutes, because competence is a kind of revenge that doesn't leave prints. And then I ate a bowl of rice with a fried egg because nothing dramatic was going to improve my blood sugar. And I slept 2 hours and woke at 3:11 a.m. when the body's security system sets off alarms. And I got up and walked to the window and watched one snowflake fall like it had missed its friends and showed up late. And I said out loud, "I will not set myself on fire to warm a man who booked a beach with my money." And I wrote that sentence down because when I write a sentence, it stops being an idea and becomes a policy. In the morning, I went to work and poured coffee and smiled at our regulars, and at 9 I called the airline with the record locator code I had gleaned from the receipt in our shared email because he had not even thought to hide it. And the woman on the phone said he had a round-trip ticket with a return seat on Saturday. And I asked about changes. And she said, "He booked a saver, ma'am," which means changes are expensive unless the flight is canceled, or he switches to a bus line partner for ground transfer. And I said, "You have a partner bus line." And she said, "We do for certain cross-border routes with cooperation through a booking portal." And I said, "Thank you." And I wrote it down with 3 underlines because the universe had just handed me a definition of poetic. And at lunch, I walked to the guilty buddy of my credit union, the bus station 2 blocks over, and I looked at the board the way a person looks at a menu they do not plan to eat from. And I found the company the airline uses for flexible returns. And I looked at their seats and their policies and their transfers, and I found the journey that would land exactly where it should. Home. Eventually, after 6 connections, 2 overnight layovers in unpleasant rooms, and a final arrival on Monday morning at 5:20 a.m. And I smiled a small, neat smile because revenge tastes better when the garnish is just a fact with a bow. The problem before the solution needed proof because a man who borrows with a lie will return with a speech. So I called my cousin Talia, who does IT for a hospital and knows how phones tell on people. And I asked her to explain geotagging to me like I was 90. And she walked me through how photos on social had location metadata and how, even if he scrubbed it, the timestamp would help me prove itinerary. And I said, "I do not want to be a detective. I want to be accurate." And she said, "Those are the same job when someone is telling you a story with missing nouns." And that night, Chris FaceTimed me from a balcony with a towel around his shoulders and the ocean behind him like a postcard from someone else's life. And he said, "Hey, the pop-up fell through, so I am getting some sun and networking at night." And I said, "With Sienna." And he flinched like a man who had not expected the name to have teeth. And he said, "She's here with friends." And I said, "And you are there with my money." And he said, "Maya, I will pay it back." And I said, "I am not a bank." And he said, "You literally work at one." And I said, "I am not your bank." And he said, "Do not make me feel guilty for treating myself after 2 years of double shifts." And I said, "I am not making you feel anything. I am telling you the math." And he said, "You always make everything a budget." And I said, "Budgets are love without lying." And he rolled his eyes and said, "I will be back Saturday. We will talk." And I said, "You will be back when your itinerary delivers you to our front door." And he grinned like a boy who thinks a test is optional and said, "I always am." And I hung up because a woman can choose to close the door at the sentence that shows you the whole house. Sometimes the worst moment in Act 2 is not the discovery, it is the echo. On Thursday, our landlord texted that rent would draft Friday, and I remembered I had moved the money out and had to hustle to cover it with the new account. And while I did my hustling, I thought about the 100 small hustles I had done inside that marriage without announcing them. And I let myself be angry, because anger is a blood supply for action when you open the right artery. And then I went to my mother's house for arroz con pollo and told her the broad outlines, and she listened with her hands flat on the table like she was holding it to the floor, and she said, "When a man borrows the salt without asking, he will one day borrow the roof." And I said, "I know." And she said, "And if he comes back wet from a storm he made, you hand him a towel and a bill." And we laughed because sometimes proverbs are just invoices in Grandma's handwriting. And I went home and changed the password on the smart lock and sent him a temporary code that would expire Saturday night, not Friday, because the plan had matured in my head. And Friday after work I bought 3 things. A little sign from the craft store with a bus on it, a prepaid card for $20 because kindness is the best garnish on a hard plate, and a lockbox for our mail because men who borrow money often borrow mail to erase receipts. And I slept like a person who had to present to a board the next day, which is to say, badly, but upright. Saturday morning arrived with cold sun that makes Denver look like a movie. And I cleaned the apartment because sometimes your hands must move to keep your mind from scolding. And I set a simple table for myself with coffee and a hard roll, and I let my head play the scene of his return, the way you practice a speech, to reduce the ums. And I stack the documents the way a clerk stacks dignity. A printout of the savings transactions, a screenshot of his caption with the beach and Sienna's heart, a copy of our joint agreement about big purchases we had made the day we merged our lives and promised to discuss anything over $300. And I wrote on an index card 3 sentences I would say and not exceed. 1, you took money without consent. 2, you lied about destination and purpose. 3, you can earn my respect back, but not in this house today. And then at 2:17 p.m. my phone buzzed with a flight update for a passenger on the record locator. Delayed, then canceled due to crew issues. And I felt nothing for 4 seconds and then felt everything for 5. And then I called the airline. And I said, I need to convert a canceled return into a partner ground option for the same passenger. And the agent said, we can do that with a small fee and a long route. And I said, the longest that lands by Monday at dawn. And she said, ma'am, are you sure? And I said, I am. And she clicked and typed and said, there is a seat on a coach bus that leaves tonight at 9:40. It will transfer in Monterrey, then Laredo, then San Antonio, then Amarillo, then Pueblo, then Denver, and the total travel time is 31 hours. And I said, book it. And she said, I will send the itinerary to the email on file. And I said, please also text it to this number. And I gave her his. And I hung up and put my phone on the table and watched it like it was a stove. And 20 seconds later, it lit up with a text to him, and then his name calling me. And I let it go to voicemail because the sentence on my card said, speak once, then stop. Not answer every time he bleeds words. And he called again, and I let it ring. And then he texted, what is this? And I texted back, it is your return ticket. And he wrote, are you kidding me? And I wrote, I am not. And he wrote, I can't take a bus across a border. And I wrote, you can. You will. And he wrote, this is cruel. And I wrote, this is a lesson with receipts. And he wrote 15 more things in a row, some messy, some ugly. And I put the phone face down and did my dishes and listened to a podcast with soft voices because soft voices help when you are doing a hard thing. And at 7, he sent a photo of himself at a bus terminal with a face that wanted to be tragic, and I put a heart reaction on it because sometimes the most sarcastic thing you can do is offer the emoji of the thing the day does not have. 9:40 came for him and 10 came for me, and I slept. And Sunday the bus crawled across the map like a slow apology, and every few hours I got a location update from the portal because I had asked for them and poured them into a folder, not to gloat, to prove. And he sent me texts at odd hours saying he was cold, saying the bathroom smelled like a mistake, saying he had never felt so alone, saying he hated me, then saying he loved me. And I did not reply because the only reply was the itinerary. And I went to my mother's for lunch, and she made caldo that tasted like yes. And I took a nap on her couch, because children become children again when the couch is the same and the blanket smells like powder. And in the evening, I went home and washed the sheets, because tomorrow I would change something bigger than a bed. And at 4:58 a.m. Monday, the tracker pinged that the bus was arriving at Union Station, and at 5:23 a.m., my phone buzzed with the building camera showing Chris at the front door, and I buzzed him in remotely, and then went downstairs to the lobby in a sweatshirt and jeans and a face with no makeup. And he walked in with a backpack that looked heavier than when he left, and a neck pillow around his neck like a punchline. And he said, what is wrong with you? And I said, I do not know. Maybe the part where my husband stole from me and went to a beach with Sienna. And he flinched and said, "It wasn't like that." And I said, "It was exactly like that." And I handed him an envelope with the prepaid card and a note that said, "Breakfast at the diner on the corner." And he said, "You are kicking me out." And I said, "I am putting you in a timeout." And he said, "We are married." And I said, "And that used to mean you had a key to my peace, but you lost it." And he said, "Let me upstairs." And I said, "No, not today." And he said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And I said, "Your friend Carlos has a couch. Your mother has a couch. The world is full of couches." And he said, "I need a shower." And I said, "Hotels have showers." And he said, "You are heartless." And I said, "I am heart and spine." And he said, "What do I have to do?" And I said, "The index card said 3 sentences, and I am at the third. You can earn my respect back, but not in this house today." And he put his hands on his head the way men do when they want to look like a statue of suffering. And I felt sorry for him for exactly 2 beats. And then I remembered the blue of that pool and the caption and the heart from Sienna. And I pressed the elevator button, not for us, for the neighbor who had come into the lobby behind him and needed to go up. And Chris looked at me and said, "What about rent?" And I said, "Rent is paid. I am good at my job." And he said, "What about my stuff?" And I said, "It will be in boxes when you bring a plan and a timeline and a cashier's check for $2,000. And he said, "I cannot do that overnight." And I said, "The bus took 31 hours. It seems overnight is not your style anyway." And the neighbor snorted because sometimes strangers are the only audience you need. And Chris walked to the door and turned back and said, "Are you serious about the money?" And I said, "I am serious about the respect. The money is the receipt." And he left, and the door closed, and I stood in the lobby for 1 full minute with my hand on the back of my neck. And then I went upstairs and made coffee, and wrote a new list because Act 3 would need choreography. And the list said, "Call a lawyer for a consult, not to blow up anything but to know the shape of the choices, change my beneficiaries and my direct deposit split to refill my Oaxaca fund, box his things with a friend present to keep the temperature of the room low, freeze the joint account to bills only and require 2 approvals for any change, start saying out loud what I will no longer fund, write my terms, and when he is ready to sign them, we can talk on a bench in a public place with coffee that tastes like reason." I spent Monday doing things that make a life hold still while your heart catches up. I called a lawyer named Dana who does family law consults and told her the broad strokes. She listened like a person listening to a weather report and said, "Here are your options. You can separate finances without filing anything. You can set a trial separation with a move-out date and a written plan. You can file. You can do nothing and hope." And she said, "The only mistake is making a long decision in a short mood." And I said, "I want time without chaos." And she said, "Then write a separation agreement that lists money, housing, and respect. Have him sign it in front of a notary and tell him any breach means the next step." And I thanked her and paid for an hour. And she sent me a template that read like a calm voice. And I cleaned the apartment with my friend Priya there as a witness because you do not need backup until you do, and then you really do. And we boxed Chris's clothes and shoes and trophies that mean more to him than to me, and his cooking books and his baseball caps and his spare chargers because men collect chargers like stray cats. And I labeled the boxes with a Sharpie and lined them by the door. And I put a small box aside with our photos in a Ziploc because, even when a story goes off the road, you do not throw away the map. And I taped a copy of the separation terms to the top of the biggest box, clear and plain. You borrowed $2,000 from my savings without consent. You lied about the trip. You will return the money within 60 days by cashier's check in 4 payments of $500. You will attend 3 counseling sessions before we decide anything else. You will not use our joint account for anything but bills, and you will not change any logins. You will not step into this apartment until we meet to talk on Saturday at noon in public. You will text to arrange a time to pick up the boxes, and you will stop speaking to Sienna until we have a decision. And I added a line that was not negotiable. If you miss a payment or use my money in any way, I will file. And I took a photo of the page with the date in the corner because paper needs backup and courage needs proof. And when Priya left, she hugged me like she was snapping a bone back into place. And I stood in my living room and felt tired in the way you do after making a thing that did not exist yesterday. He texted at 4 with a simple line, "Can I get my stuff tonight?" And I wrote, "Yes, Gabe will be here at 6 to help you carry." And he sent 10 question marks because he did not like that a man who has known him since middle school would see him like this. And at 6, Gabe showed up in his work hoodie and said, "I'm on your side." And when Chris knocked, Gabe opened and said, "You got what you came with." And they carried boxes down 3 flights while I stood by the door with my arms folded like a bouncer. And Chris looked at me once and then looked away, because the gaze of a person you hurt can feel like a mirror you are not ready to stand in. And when the last box was out, I handed him the separation agreement and a pen, and he said, "You can't be serious." And I said, "Be as serious as the bus." And he signed, because sometimes a man who thought he had all the words runs out and has to use an instrument that does not require sound. And he took a picture too, and that was fine, because mutual records make future fights shorter. And he said, "Can I call you tomorrow?" And I said, "Text me once with a screenshot of your payment plan and we will meet Saturday." And he said, "You're making me the villain." And I said, "You made a set of choices and they add up to a shape. If you do not like the shape, make new choices." And he left, and the door closed, and the quiet felt like clean water. And I sat with my back against it until my legs tingled, because sometimes your body needs to know the door is yours. Tuesday to Friday were small and busy. I went to work and balanced accounts, and opened a new youth savings for a boy who wants to buy a bike by May. And I made dinner for my mother and helped her fix a cabinet hinge. And I walked in the park with Priya and let wind clean me from the inside. And I took a counseling intake call for myself because people who build lists also need to feel held. And I did not answer Chris's 10 a.m. texts that were not plans but weather reports from his feelings. I replied to the 2 that were useful. One saying he had borrowed $400 from his cousin to make payment 1, and one asking for the address of the notary. And I told him. And when the first cashier's check photo arrived, I did not clap. I saved it to a folder called Repayment and set a reminder to deposit. And I opened a new sub-account labeled Oaxaca and threw the 500 into it and moved my automation back to the first of the month. And the name Oaxaca in my app made me feel like a person who had steadied a picture on a wall after a truck rumbled by. Saturday we met on a bench in a public square with a coffee truck selling hot chocolate that smelled like a good idea. And he looked like a man who had not slept, and a man who had slept too much. And he said, "I don't want to lose you." And I said, "You should have thought of that when you wanted to treat yourself with my money." And he said, "I thought you would understand." And I said, "I understand wanting. I do not understand stealing." And he said, "It was borrowing." And I said, "If the company had asked before the transfer, it would have been borrowing." And he stared at the fountain like it was going to say a sentence that would save him. And then he said, "I blocked Sienna." And I said, "Good." And he said, "I'll do counseling." And I said, "Good." And he said, "Do you still love me?" And I said, "I love the version of you that tells the truth." And he whispered, "Okay." And he cried a little, and I handed him a napkin because humans leak. And we set the next 2 meetings, and he left. And I went to my mother's and sat at her table and put my head on my arms. And she stroked my hair like she did when I was 8 and had a fever and cried because a fever steals your perspective. And she said, I am proud of you for not turning your whole life into a test he could fail and then use as an excuse. And I said, I am tired. And she said, rest. And I did on her couch under the same blanket that always smells like powder. Counseling was a slow kitchen. Nothing boiled. But things got warm. The therapist asked him why he thinks risk equals worth and why being seen at a pool with a pretty woman felt like proof of life. And he said he hates how small our apartment is and how my list book makes him feel like a guest in a hotel run by me. And I said, the list book keeps our lights on and our peace steady. And the therapist said, what would your own book look like if you wrote one? And he blinked because the idea that he could hold a pen and not just criticize mine had not visited him. And she told him to write down 10 ways he could turn himself into a man he likes without using anyone else's money. He wrote, I can pick up a second weekend shift that pays cash. I can ask my boss for the line on pasta night. I can call a community college about a knife skills class that costs $80, not a trip to a beach. I can return the sneakers I do not need. I can sell the old speakers. I can cook dinner twice a week and not just when I want applause. I can plan a free date. I can apologize to her mother. I can bring a cashier's check on time. I can stop telling myself I am owed. And I sat there and watched him write and felt something in me move from locked to ajar. And the therapist turned to me and said, and you, how do you make space without making a rescue? And I said, I can put him on the utility portal so he sees the numbers I see. I can let him make dinner and not adjust the salt with my face. I can ask for what I want without turning it into a manual. I can forgive when the deposit hits and not before. I can go to Oaxaca no matter what. And she smiled because goals make counselors clap inside their heads. Payment 2 arrived, then 3. And with each deposit, I let a small piece of rage exit like steam from a covered pot. Not all of it. Rage has a job too. It keeps your hand from petting a dog that bites, but enough to walk without the weight of a wet coat. And Chris moved into a small sublet with a couch that sags, and a sink that runs, and a window that faces a wall. And he sent me a photo the first night making a simple dinner in a pan, and the plate looked like humility, not a performance. And he did not post it because the point was not applause. And I visited once to pick up a book, and I stood in the doorway and looked at the sink and the wall, and felt sorry for and proud of him at the same time. And I left without lingering because I am not a tour guide in a museum he built. And we kept meeting on Saturdays, and the words got less defensive and more useful. And on a Sunday, we went to the park and walked 2 loops and did not argue. We just let the wind do some of the heavy work. And then we sat on a bench, and he said, I know you were planning Oaxaca. And I said, I am going in June. And he said, I would like to drive you to the airport if we are in a place where that is not presumptuous. And I said, it will not be presumptuous. It will be a ride. And he said, I want to be better than a ride. And I said, I know. And we went to our separate apartments, and I lit a candle and made tea and booked my cooking class with my aunt, and cried a little because joy waiting on the other side of a hard door will make you cry every time. 2 months after the bus, I got a message from Sienna on Instagram because people who thrive on attention do not vanish. She wrote, I feel bad. I didn't know he was using your money. He told me you were on a break, and I typed and erased 3 sentences and then wrote the truth. I do not need your apology, and I do not need your confession. I need you to keep your distance and learn that a man who will lie for you will lie to you. And she hearted it and sent a shrug, and I blocked her because my peace is a room with a door that closes, and my phone is the doorknob. And I went for a run with Priya in the cold, and we laughed so hard at a dog in a sweater that we had to stop. And in laughter, I remembered I was not a role in someone else's play. I was a person who could plan events and pay bills and book a bus with a stroke of a key and write a list that makes a storm walk in a line. The last payment arrived on a Thursday. A crisp cashier's check that I deposited at my credit union with a teller who grinned because she likes a clean story. And I moved the money into Oaxaca and then into a CD for 3 months to keep my fingers off it and to make the point that money likes a nap if you let it. And after I left, I stood in the parking lot and felt a small bird in my chest settle. And that night, Chris and I met at a taco truck and ate on the hood of his borrowed car and talked about nothing and everything. And he said, I am sorry again, not for the 10th time, for the first time the way a man says it when he knows the weight of the word. And I said, I believe you mean it. And he said, I want to come home. And I said, I want a partner, not a roommate. And he said, I brought the forms for couples therapy weekly. And I said, good. And we set a date for June to revisit the lease. Not our hearts. Those would be revisited every Saturday like a church you attend even when you doubt. And he hugged me in a way that respected the bench rules, hands high, time short, and I went home and slept in the middle of the bed and did not feel lonely. Then came the twist that felt like a bow on my own decision. 2 weeks before Oaxaca, I got a call from the bus company's customer service, a man named Victor. He said, Ms. Delgado, I am calling because we review feedback on cross-border routes, and your name is on a note from a driver praising you for arranging an itinerary that taught a passenger respect. And I laughed, because that sentence is funny and true, and he said, we have a community program that donates 2 tickets a year to nonprofits. Do you know any group that could use them? And I said, yes. The shelter where my mother volunteers has 2 residents who need travel to reunite with family. And he said, perfect. And I hung up and told my mother, and she cried, because kindness landing in your lap after a year like mine feels like rain after a smoke summer. And we coordinated the tickets and printed them, and I watched 2 women hold paper with their names on it and know they were going to be loaded into someone else's arms in 48 hours. And I thought, this is what a bus can be when it is not a lesson. It can be a path. June came and I flew to Oaxaca, and my aunt met me with a hug that smells like cumin and lipstick, and the market smelled like fruit that tastes like color. And we chopped onions with women who laugh with their whole bodies, and I stood over a pot and stirred mole negro until my arm ached and my heart stopped aching. And we ate at long tables, and I learned that recipes are ledgers too. You list what matters and you do not overfill it. And one evening at sunset on a rooftop, I texted Chris a photo of my plate and wrote, I am safe and happy. And he wrote, good, and did not add anything because sometimes respect is not filling a small space with big words. And when I flew home, he was waiting at arrivals with a sign that said, welcome back, chef, because he knows how to be corny. And he put my suitcase in the trunk and said, the apartment is clean. And it was, and there were flowers on the counter. Not expensive flowers, grocery tulips in a jar, which is the right price for a man who is learning. We did not rush. We did not pretend the bus was a cure or the checks were a benediction. We made rules and we kept them. We moved the money talk to Thursdays, and we sat at the table and opened the portal and moved our eyes slowly over the lines until both of us could say yes and know that yes did not mean I give up. It meant I understand. We stopped using the phrase, treat yourself as a hall pass, and started using it as a question. What treat have we earned this month that does not make a mess? Sometimes the answer was a hike and a sandwich. Sometimes it was new sheets on sale. Sometimes it was letting one of us go to a movie alone, because silence is a treat too. And we kept counseling, and I learned to ask for help in sentences shorter than a grocery list. And he learned to put a deposit down on trust by answering a text with a photo of a receipt before I asked. And he showed me a savings envelope labeled Knives Class, and he went to it and came back with calluses and a story about a chef who taught him to make an omelet that did not stick. And I ate it and did not adjust the salt with my face, and we chose together to renew the lease with a new clause. No debt to each other that is not written and signed. No trips booked with money the other does not know about. No secrets that start with a letter from the bank, and we put the clause on the fridge. And Lily from the Annex story would have approved if she had lived with us, because candy canes are a policy, and so is a piece of paper with lines. If you are waiting for me to say, we divorced and I changed the locks and danced, that is a good story too, and maybe yours. But mine was different. Mine was a bus and a bench, and a bowl of mole, and a pair of aprons hanging on the back of a kitchen chair. Mine was not forgiving on day one. It was making him feel exactly how long 31 hours are, and letting that duration become a unit he could measure his choices against. Every time he was tempted to use a word like borrow, without asking, he saw a terminal at dawn, and a bathroom that smelled like a mistake, and a neck pillow that became a punchline, and that image saved us money and time and something like love. And my revenge was not a flame that burned our house. It was a route with 6 connections that brought him back to the door with humility, and me to my window seat with a view of a city I had earned. And if he ever forgets again, I have the itinerary printed in a folder labeled Consequences, and I have the number for Victor at the bus line, and I have a blue notebook with a fresh page that can hold another plan. And I have a mother who will say a proverb that sounds like an invoice, and a friend who will bring a Sharpie and a cousin who can pull a geotag with one hand, and I have myself, 32 and steady, with a savings account in my own name, and a set of receipts that do not shake when I hold them. If you need one last image from me, take this one. It is a Saturday in August, and I am at our kitchen table with a bowl of fruit and a cup of coffee. The window is open, and the city carries up the sound of a bus braking, a hiss like a long exhale, and Chris is at the stove, making eggs that slide and do not stick, and my blue notebook is on the table with a list that says, small groceries, call mom, walk with Priya, and a line at the bottom that says, Oaxaca recipes for dinner, and the flowers on the counter are not grocery tulips. They are marigolds from a farmer's market like little suns, and my phone buzzes with an alert that says, automatic transfer to Oaxaca subaccount. And I smile because Oaxaca is not a place you go once. It is a way of cooking your life, slow and with dark chocolate and patience and heat you control. And if the bus sound makes me laugh, I let it. And if it makes me straighten my spine, I let that too. And when Chris puts a plate in front of me, he does not say, treat yourself. He says, is the salt right? And I taste, and I say, yes. And the yes is for the eggs and for the day and for the woman who drew a line on a map and made a man come home on it, and for the way a budget bus became a measuring stick, and for the way I learned to be heart and spine at the same time, with a pen in my pocket and a ticket in my drawer, just in case.